Welcome. Tonight, let's take a gentle walk down memory lane. Imagine the warm sun setting over golden fields, the distant hum of cicadas, and the scent of fresh earth after a summer rain. In this story, we return to a childhood spent on a quiet country farm, where love lived in the little things and the world moved a little slower. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the calmness of this tale carry you into peaceful sleep. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as I turned off the highway and onto the old dirt road. It had been years, decades really, since I'd taken this turn, and yet everything felt achingly familiar. The trees on either side bowed inward, forming a loose tunnel of green, the way they always had. The shadows they cast moved gently in the warm afternoon sun, just as I remembered from long summer days of my youth. I slowed the car to a crawl, rolled down the window, and let the wind pour in. It carried with it the scent of dry grass, wild flowers, and something else. Faint but unmistakable. The earthy, sweet smell of home. It was the smell of my childhood, of the farm where I'd spent so many days with Grandma and Grandpa. And though so much time had passed, my heart knew the way. The gate was still there, rusty, slightly crooked, but standing. I got out of the car, dust rising around my shoes, and unlatched it by hand. The iron was warm to the touch, and the latch creaked in protest as I swung the gate open. I stood there for a long moment, taking it in. The way the road curved gently past the field, the outline of the barn roof just barely visible above the tall grass, and beyond it, the old farmhouse perched at the edge of the tree line like a sentinel watching over the land. I parked the car by the fence and decided to walk the rest of the way. The sky above was a rich, late summer blue, cloudless and vast. Cicadas sang their rhythmic song, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. With every step, memories rose around me like warm mist. The path toward the house was just as I remembered, worn and soft from years of use. My feet found it naturally, as if I had never left. The grass on either side had grown tall, brushing against my jeans as I walked. I could see the outline of the vegetable garden to the right, long overgrown, and the wooden trellis that once held climbing beans, now empty but still standing defiantly. As I reached the front steps of the farmhouse, I paused. The paint on the door had faded, chipped away by time and weather, but it was still that same soft shade of green Grandma had chosen. I ran my fingers over the wood. It felt rougher now, but real. Solid. I stepped onto the porch. The boards gave slightly under my weight, groaning in protest just like they used to when I'd sneak out after dark to chase fireflies. The old rocking chair was still there too, its wicker seat weathered but intact. I could almost see Grandpa in it, a book in his lap, glasses low on his nose, pretending not to doze off as the sun dipped behind the trees. I sat down in the chair. It still rocked smooth and steady. I closed my eyes, letting the breeze wash over me. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a moment I could hear her humming. Grandma in the kitchen, baking something sweet, probably apple pie. That tune she always carried, wordless but warm, full of quiet joy. The screen door creaked open in my mind, and I imagined the way she would peer out at me with a playful sternness. "You're letting the flies in," she'd say, though she never really minded. I opened my eyes slowly, and for a while just sat there, watching, remembering. The house looked worn but proud, like an old friend that had waited patiently for me to return. The windows reflected the sky, and I wondered how many storms they'd seen, how many sunsets they'd framed. Eventually, I stood up and stepped inside. The door stuck a little at the bottom, like it always had, and I had to give it a little extra push. The scent hit me immediately. Not just dust and age, but something deeper. Cedar wood, old cotton, the faintest trace of cinnamon. It was as if the house had held onto every moment, every echo, waiting to offer them back. The front room was dim and quiet, lit only by the light pouring in through the west-facing window. The furniture was still arranged the same way. The big floral couch sat under the window, a crocheted blanket draped over the back, and Grandma's armchair, slightly sunken in, faced the fireplace. On the mantel, her little collection of porcelain birds still stood in a perfect row, untouched by time. I moved slowly through the room, running my hand along the side table, the old radio with the big tuning dial. I remembered how Grandpa would sit in that chair, the baseball game playing softly in the background, while he sipped coffee from his chipped blue mug. In the kitchen, the linoleum floor was worn to a dull sheen, but it was clean. The same checkered curtains framed the window above the sink, and the view beyond was as I remembered. The back pasture, the windmill in the distance, and the tall oak tree where we'd once hung a tire swing. I opened a cupboard and found the old mugs, neatly stacked. I pulled down the blue one and held it in my hands. It still had the little chip near the handle, the one I'd once tried to fix with glue when I was 10. I smiled. I sat down at the kitchen table, just like I had so many mornings long ago. Grandma would be at the stove, humming, frying bacon or stirring oatmeal, and Grandpa would be reading the newspaper, his glasses low, pausing only to share the headlines aloud. Sometimes they'd bicker gently, about the weather, about the cows, about how much sugar he was putting in his coffee. I reached out and touched the table, the worn wood cool beneath my fingertips. This table had seen so much. Birthday cakes, school projects, Sunday dinners, early morning coffee, late night talks. It had been the heart of the house, just like they had been the heart of my world. I didn't know how long I sat there, just breathing it in. Eventually, I stood, walked back to the living room, and opened the back door. The hinges squeaked, just like they always had, and I stepped out onto the back porch. The sun was beginning to dip now, casting long golden shadows across the fields. The cicadas had quieted, replaced by the softer sounds of early evening. Somewhere, a mourning dove called. I looked out across the land they had worked, cared for, loved. I thought about the years they'd spent here. The laughter, the hardships, the quiet moments in between. And I realized I hadn't just come back to a place. I had come back to a feeling, to a piece of myself that I had left behind. I took a deep breath, the air warm and full of memory, and then I stepped off the porch, onto the grass, and began to walk. Toward the barn, toward the fields, toward the rest of the story. The screen door clicked shut behind me as I stepped back inside. The last rays of sunlight slanted through the windows, turning the dust in the air into gold. I stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. This house, even in silence, felt alive. Its bones creaked softly with memory. I wandered back into the kitchen, drawn there as if by instinct. It had always been the center of everything, the place where mornings began and days wound down, where stories were told over cups of coffee, and where Grandma's soft singing wrapped around the smell of cinnamon or bacon, depending on the hour. The stove was still there, the same pale green enamel with silver knobs and a clock that had long ago stopped ticking. Next to it sat the same salt and pepper shakers in the shape of little cows, chipped but standing proudly. I ran my fingers across the counter, smooth with wear, and opened the drawer beside the sink. Inside were neatly stacked dish towels, folded just the way she used to do it. I pulled one out, held it to my face. It smelled faintly of lavender and sunlight, though I knew that had to be my memory doing the work. Still, I let the scent carry me. It was in this kitchen that I first learned the rhythm of real life. Slow, deliberate, rooted. There was a comfort in the rituals, kneading dough, shelling peas, boiling jars for canning. Grandma always moved with calm assurance. Her hands were never still, always preparing, folding, slicing, scrubbing. But her presence was quiet and grounding. I remembered sitting at the little kitchen table with my elbows on the wood, watching her move. She didn't talk much while she worked, but when she did, it was always worth listening to. She had a gentle voice, low and steady, like a lullaby with words. "There's no use rushing," she'd say, folding a towel with perfect corners. "The pie won't bake faster just because you want it to." Sometimes I'd help, standing on a chair, apron tied around me like armor, cutting cookie dough or pressing a fork into peanut butter cookies to make the crisscross pattern. I never did it quite right, but she never corrected me. She'd just smile and let me figure it out. I could still hear the clatter of dishes in the sink, the sound of the percolator bubbling on the stove, the soft thud of her footsteps as she moved from counter to table and back again. Time moved differently here, slower, kinder. I walked over to the old wooden pantry door and pulled it open. Inside I found rows of empty jars lining the shelves, each with a handwritten label that had faded over time. Apple butter, 83, dill pickles, blackberry jam. The handwriting was hers, looping and graceful, each letter holding a piece of her. I remembered the coolness of the pantry in summer, stepping in barefoot to escape the heat, the smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. I'd sneak a sugar cube sometimes. She always knew but never said a word. I sat down again at the kitchen table. It was late afternoon now, and the light had turned amber, softening the edges of everything. Dust danced lazily in the air. I closed my eyes and let myself fall backward in time. I was 10 again, sitting across from Grandpa. He had his glasses on, the newspaper spread open in front of him, and a mug of black coffee in his hand. He'd glance up now and then to offer a piece of news or shake his head with a small laugh. "Rain's coming," he'd say, looking not at the sky, but at the bones in his knuckles. "You can feel it." He was always right. Sometimes he'd tell stories about the war, about riding a horse to school, about planting the orchard with his own father. I didn't always understand them, but I listened closely. His voice was like the land, deep, patient, full of layers. There was one story he told every summer about the day he and Grandma met at a county fair. He'd describe how she was carrying a lemon pie she had made for a contest, and how he pretended to trip so he could catch it. And her Grandma would always chime in from the sink. He didn't catch anything but trouble, but she'd be smiling when she said it. They were like that, two different kinds of quiet that had found a way to fit together. She'd hum while she worked. He'd whistle. She read cookbooks like novels. He read novels like instruction manuals. And yet they moved around each other with such grace, like a dance rehearsed so many times it became instinct. I looked down at the tabletop again, tracing the small nicks and scratches. I remembered setting the table with Grandma, how she'd lay out the cloth napkins with care, how she'd let me light the little candle at the center once I was old enough. We always used the good plates, even on Tuesdays. "Every day you get is a good one." And I remembered the meals, the fried chicken that crunched just right, the buttermilk biscuits with honey, the slow-cooked green beans with pieces of bacon, the cobbler that always burned the tongue if you didn't wait long enough. We'd sit for hours, talking between bites, or just enjoying the sound of the wind through the open windows. And afterward, when the plates were cleared, she'd pour herself a small glass of sweet tea, and he'd push back from the table with a satisfied sigh. Sometimes he'd turn on the old radio and play something soft, Patsy Cline, maybe, or Johnny Cash, and they'd sway together by the sink, their hands clasped, eyes closed. Even as a child, I knew I was witnessing something rare. Now the kitchen was quiet again, but the echo of those moments still lived in the walls. I could feel them like warmth from a sunbeam that had just slipped away. I stood slowly, feeling the ache of memory in my chest, and walked into the hallway. The light was dimmer here, but the familiar creak of the floorboards welcomed me. I passed the little alcove where Grandma used to keep her aprons, still hanging there like she might come back at any moment to tie one on. To the left was the den, and to the right, the small hallway that led to the bedrooms. I paused there, fingers resting on the edge of the doorframe, and breathed in the silence. It was not empty. It was full of everything. I turned back toward the kitchen and caught a glimpse of the backyard through the window. The light was golden now, the sky just beginning to blush pink. I knew that outside, the barn and pasture waited, each carrying their own stories. But here, in the heart of the house, I had found the first pieces of myself again, and I was ready to keep walking. The screen door creaked open again as I stepped out into the backyard. The warm air met me like a familiar hand on the shoulder. Everything out here seemed softer in the evening light. The wind had quieted to a hush, and the trees rustled gently like they were whispering to one another. The grass was long, taller than I remembered, and swayed lazily in the breeze. I walked slowly down the wooden steps from the porch and into the yard. The soil beneath my feet was dry, warm, and full of memory. To my left I saw the vegetable garden, what was left of it anyway. Once so full of life and order, it was now a small jungle of wild greenery and tangled vines. But even in its abandonment, it still carried echoes of Grandma's touch. She used to wake up with the sun and head out here, with her straw hat, kneeling in the rows with a quiet determination. Her hands moved through the plants like they were old friends, snapping beans, checking tomato vines, gently brushing dirt from the carrots as she pulled them from the ground. She'd hum while she worked, and I'd follow her around, barefoot and sleepy-eyed, carrying the basket that would slowly fill with vegetables and herbs. I knelt beside what used to be the tomato row and brushed the leaves aside. One stubborn vine had managed to produce a tiny red fruit, perfectly round. I smiled. Life was persistent like that, especially here. Beyond the garden, the barn stood in silhouette against the glowing sky. It was weathered and slanted now, its red paint faded to a dusty rose. The roof was missing a few shingles, and one of the side doors hung slightly off its hinges, but it still stood tall, proud, and unwavering. I walked toward it, the path familiar beneath the overgrowth. As I reached the barn doors, I paused, placing a hand against the wood. The surface was rough, full of age and sun, but solid. The barn had been the center of so many adventures, a kingdom, a pirate ship, a spaceship, anything I wanted it to be. Grandpa used to let me climb the hay bales inside while he worked. He'd whistle a slow tune, the same one every time, and I'd echo it back from the rafter. I pushed open the door and stepped into the dim coolness of the barn. The scent hit me immediately. Dried hay, old wood, oil, and the faint trace of livestock. It was like opening a time capsule. Dust floated in the air, catching the last light slipping through the cracks in the boards. I could see the outlines of old tools still hanging on the far wall, neatly organized the way Grandpa always kept them. There was the pitchfork, the saw, the little hand drill he once let me try with supervision and great ceremony. To the right, the workbench was still intact. I walked over and brushed away a fine layer of dust. I remembered watching Grandpa here, his thick hands steady and sure, sanding a piece of wood or fixing a broken hinge. He didn't say much while he worked, but I loved being beside him, handing him nails or holding the flashlight at just the right angle. Sometimes, when the work was done, he'd sit on an overturned bucket, take off his hat, and wipe the sweat from his brow. I'd sit beside him, and we'd just listen to the wind outside or the gentle rustle of the animals in the stalls. It was in those quiet minutes I felt closest to him, not in the words, but in the stillness. I looked over toward the old hayloft ladder. It was still there, though it looked a bit less trustworthy now. Still, the urge to climb it stirred in me. I resisted. Some things were better left untouched, at least for now. Instead, I wandered toward the back of the barn, where the stalls once held the cows and the horse they kept for many years, a gentle mare named Daisy who loved apple slices and hated thunder. I remembered brushing her coat under Grandpa's watchful eye, feeling the warmth and strength beneath the softness of her fur. She'd nuzzle my hand for more treats, and I'd giggle every time her lips tickled my palm. Even the chickens had their place back here, though their coop had long since collapsed. I could still hear their clucking, the way they'd scatter when I came running with scraps of bread. And I could still see Grandma's hands collecting eggs in her apron, careful not to crack a single one. I stood in the middle of the barn, eyes closed, listening to nothing, and everything. The years hadn't erased these memories. They had deepened them, given them weight. I could feel them pressing gently against my chest, like a hand holding mine. After a long moment, I stepped back outside. The sun had slipped below the horizon, and the sky was painted in layers of lavender, peach, and deepening blue. Fireflies blinked in the grass like little lanterns, and the first stars began to appear above the trees. I walked slowly back toward the house, the twilight wrapping around me like a warm shawl. The air smelled of honeysuckle now, and the sound of crickets had begun to swell. I paused halfway to the porch and looked back at the barn. It stood there in the dusk like a memory made solid, weathered but alive, full of stories. And I knew then that this place wasn't just where I grew up. It was part of who I was. The stars were out now, scattered across the sky like freckles on a child's cheek. I stood on the back porch for a while, watching them come alive, one by one. The Milky Way stretched across the horizon like a whisper, and I could hear the distant hoot of an owl calling from somewhere deep in the woods. I stepped off the porch and followed the worn path past the garden and barn, heading toward the open fields behind the property. The air was cooler now, the kind of crispness that clung to the skin and made you breathe just a little deeper. It carried with it the smell of clover, warm dirt, and hay, familiar, soothing scents that wrapped around me like a memory. The fields stretched far beyond the fence line, rolling gently into the horizon. During the day, they were golden and buzzing with bees, but now, under the moonlight, they looked like a vast sea of silver green. I remembered running through them barefoot, chasing grasshoppers and butterflies, falling into the tall grass and staring up at the clouds until the sun dipped behind the trees. Those fields were my playground. Some summer days, Grandpa would take me out there early in the morning, long before the sun got too hot. We'd carry a small basket for berries or a pair of shovels if we were turning soil. He'd point out animal tracks and show me which plants were safe to touch and which ones to avoid. He had a kind of quiet reverence for the land, and I absorbed it without realizing. He'd kneel down, press his fingers into the dirt, and say, "This is good earth, black and rich. You take care of it, and it'll take care of you." There was a rhythm to it all. Planting, growing, harvesting, and he moved with it like a man dancing to a song only he could hear. And when we were done, when the sun was high and sweat lined our brows, we'd sit under the big oak tree at the edge of the field and drink sweet tea from a glass jar. That tree was still there. I wandered over to it now, my steps slowing. Its branches reached wide, a great wooden guardian at the edge of everything. I used to climb that tree, settling into its sturdy arms with a book, or simply to look out over the land. From up there, the world felt endless and safe. Beneath the tree, the ground was soft with fallen leaves and moss. I sat down with my back against the trunk and looked out over the field. Fireflies drifted lazily through the tall grass, and the hum of crickets grew louder in the quiet. I closed my eyes and let my mind wander. I remembered lying on a blanket in the middle of the field, staring at clouds, with my grandfather beside me. He'd make up stories about their shapes, pointing out dragons, castles, sailing ships. He had a soft imagination beneath that weathered face, and when he laughed, it was low and sudden, like thunder from a summer storm. And then there were the woods. Just past the fields was a narrow path that led into a patch of forest. Small, by most standards, but to a child, it was a wild kingdom. I followed it now, the way I had 1,000 times before, brushing aside overgrown branches and ducking beneath a fallen limb that had once been my bridge over an imaginary moat. The trees here were tall and close together, their leaves forming a soft canopy that turned daylight into a green haze. Even now, at night, it didn't feel frightening, just quiet, peaceful. I moved carefully, my feet remembering where to step, where to avoid the tangle of roots and the soft spots of earth. In the center of the woods was a little clearing where the sunlight used to fall like a spotlight. I found it again, though the light had long since faded. The ground was covered in pine needles and tiny white mushrooms, and the air smelled like damp bark and moss. This was where I used to pretend I was an explorer, or a fairy, or a knight. I built forts here with fallen branches and lined the edges with rocks. Once, Grandma brought me a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper and sat on a stump, while I showed her my kingdom. She listened with the seriousness of someone being told the most important story in the world. "You've got quite the imagination," she'd said, smiling. "That's a gift, you know. Don't ever let it go." I hadn't meant to stay this long, but now, seated in the clearing with the trees gently swaying overhead, I didn't want to leave. The past wasn't just memory here. It was something living. Something that rose up through the roots and whispered in the leaves. I could almost hear the laughter of my younger self echoing between the trunks. Eventually I stood and made my way back through the woods, through the field, back toward the house. The porch light glowed warmly in the distance, a little beacon in the dark. As I got closer, the sounds of the night settled in around me. The steady drone of frogs from the nearby pond, the occasional bark of a distant dog, the rustling of wind through the tall grass. When I reached the porch steps, I paused and turned around one last time. The fields stretched out behind me, the barn a soft shadow in the night. The woods stood silent and watchful at the edge of it all. And I thought, what a beautiful thing it is to come back to a place that shaped you, a place that held you, a place that remembered you. The porch boards creaked under my steps as I returned, and I reached for the screen door with a tired hand. The night had settled fully now, deep and quiet, with only the occasional call of a night bird or the hum of cicadas breaking the silence. Inside, the house felt warmer, as if it had waited for me to return. I didn't bother turning on many lights. The soft glow from the lamp in the living room was enough. It painted the walls in honey-colored light, casting long, comforting shadows on the floorboards. I stood in the middle of the room for a while, listening to the silence. There was something sacred in it, this hush that held the weight of memory. My eyes drifted to the shelves, still lined with old books. Some of them I had read with Grandma on rainy afternoons, curled up under a blanket, with the smell of lemon cookies drifting from the kitchen. Others were Grandpa's manuals and almanacs, books about farming and woodworking, the pages worn from years of reference. On the mantel above the fireplace sat the old wind-up clock. It was still ticking, slowly, faithfully. That sound had been the heartbeat of the house. As a child, I used to lie on the rug and listen to it until I fell asleep, letting it rock me like a lullaby. I wandered back into the kitchen and opened a cabinet out of habit. The chipped blue mugs were still there, along with a jar of honey so crystallized it must have been forgotten for years. The drawers still held tea towels, faded and frayed from use. I ran my fingers over one of them, tracing the pattern of tiny stitched flowers. I poured myself a glass of water and stepped outside again, this time onto the front porch. The swing creaked gently as I sat, the cushions thin but familiar. The sky above was full now, deep velvet blue, scattered with stars, the moon hanging low and wide like a guardian watching over it all. I sipped slowly and let my thoughts wander. I thought about the last summer I spent here, the one before everything changed. Grandpa's hands had grown slower, and Grandma's eyes didn't always focus the way they used to, but they still made jam that summer, still danced in the kitchen, still sat on this very swing, holding hands in the early morning before the day got too hot. They had grown old together with a quiet grace, and even now, even in their absence, I felt them here. I leaned back and let the swing move, the rhythm familiar, the wood creaking in time with the breeze. Somewhere an old screen door slammed shut in my mind, and I heard Grandma calling me in for supper. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The scent of lilacs, of sun-warmed earth and old wood wrapped around me like a soft blanket. I felt a tear slip down my cheek. Not from sadness, not exactly, but from a full, aching gratitude. For all of it. For the barefoot summers and homemade jam, for the barn and the big oak tree, for muddy hands and quiet dinners, for laughter in the cornfield, for Grandpa's whistle and Grandma's humming, for love that lingered in the walls. Eventually I rose from the swing and went inside, locking the door behind me with a soft click. I turned off the lamp and the room fell into shadow, the clock ticking on in the dark. I made my way upstairs, the steps creaking beneath me, and opened the door to the guest room, my old bedroom. The quilt on the bed was the same one Grandma had sewn, patches of old shirts and dresses stitched into a story only she could tell. I lay down and pulled the quilt up to my chin. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. The house sighed around me. And I let myself drift back into the memories, back into the sounds, into the warmth of it all. And just before sleep found me, I whispered a soft, quiet thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the house, to the land, to them. And in that old room, wrapped in stillness, I dreamed of a childhood spent under open skies in fields of gold, where love lived in the ordinary and every day was a treasure. And so the night settles in, wrapping the old farmhouse in stillness once more. The memories fade gently, like fireflies blinking out across the field, leaving only warmth behind. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through the past. I hope it brought you a sense of peace and reminded you of something kind and familiar. Now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let sleep carry you home. Good night.